Let me just sort of start by asking a couple questions. How many people here have heard of Fannie Lou Hamer? Okay, well, a couple. How many have heard of Medgar Evers? Got a lot of attention recently. How many have heard of Rosa Parks? A trick question. Yeah, I know he's going to say, I haven't heard of Rosa Parks, probably. Well, there's a very good chance that you would have not have heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, that you would have not have heard of Medgar Evers, and possibly not have heard of Rosa Parks had it not been for T.R.M. Howard. And I'm going to make my case here, see if you're convinced. But let's first a little background about Dr. Howard. He, at the time he died in 1976, got very little attention. There was no write-up in Ebony magazine. I think there was a mention in Jet. I don't even think it was mentioned in the Chicago Tribune. He died in Chicago, so it wasn't a very big deal at all. So at that point, he was kind of an unknown figure, at least nationally. In 1955, though, it was a very different story. He was a key leader in the civil rights movement, probably the key leader of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. He was a rising star who seemed really poised on the edge of further fame. And he had risen to national prominence after the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, which struck down legalized segregation. What he had done is in Mississippi, he had campaigned for enforcement of the decision. And then after that, he followed that up by playing a very key role in the Emmett Till case. How many have heard of Emmett Till? Well, Howard plays a key role in bringing that case to national attention in the first place, helping to find evidence to try to convict the murderers of Till, and we'll talk about that as well. But as a result of these activities, he was a favorite villain of segregationists in Mississippi by that time. He's also much praised by the black press as a result of his activities. The Chicago Defender, which was perhaps the leading black newspaper at the time, probably is now. Of course, newspapers aren't doing that well anymore. Described him as Mississippi's most hated and feared Negro leader, which wasn't too far from the truth. January 1956, the Defender ranked Howard as number one in its annual honor roll of those who had done the most to advance the rights of blacks. At this time, you can see Martin Luther King is not on the list. Of course, he's just getting his start at this point. So he's definitely on the honor roll in the following year. But and you see some of these cases that some of these individuals Howard had some close involvement with during that period. And he's praised here for arousing the nation to the criminal conspiracy of white supremacists in the state of Mississippi. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about his background, where he came from. He was born in 1908 in Murray, Kentucky. His birth name was Theodore Roosevelt Howard, born during the administration of President Roosevelt. I don't know if there's any particular significance to that. I was never able to find if there was. Although there are some interesting parallels between the two, which we can talk about, I suppose. His parents were divorced when he was a child. They were both very poor laborers. So unlike most civil rights leaders, and most of the prominent ones, he did not come from a middle-class background. His parents were tobacco twisters. His mother got a job in a white-owned hospital as a cook, and Howard would, sort of hang around there. And the head of the hospital was named Will Mason, and Mason was impressed by the young man because one day he said to this little kid, his parents were tobacco twisters. He said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And he said, "I want to be a doctor." And so I said, "Oh, all right." So he put him to work in the hospital, working various jobs in the kitchen, orderly, anything, right? And Howard was, he helped to take care of his handicapped son and so forth. And because of Mason, Howard gets involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Mason is a kind of an exceptional figure in the area, Republican Seventh-day Adventist in Western Kentucky. Not that common. And he uses his influence to help Howard help put Howard through school. Howard worked as well, but Mason sort of opens the door. So Howard goes to, skipping to that. Let's talk a little about where he went to school. He went to a black Seventh-day Adventist school, which is the most famous alumni perhaps is Little Richard, Oakwood College in Huntsville. And then he was the only black student in a Seventh-day Adventist college in Nebraska. And I believe the only black student in the graduating class of medical school, which was it was Seventh-day Adventist school, called the College of Medical Evangelists, now known as Loma Linda University. And Howard graduated there in 1936, experienced a lot of racial discrimination along the way. He was very idealistic, Seventh-day Adventist missionary, going out there, had a pretty good experience at Oakwood, but then he went to these predominantly white schools, Union College especially, where they were bringing in segregation, and he commented upon this, about how this was so disillusioning. Well, when he came out, he worked, he was basically the head of the main Seventh-day Adventist medical center in the South for blacks. But then he sort of took a chance. He got a job offer, and it was to come to this place in Mississippi called the Taborian Hospital. It was run by a fraternal society called the International Order of 12 Knights and Daughters of Tabor. It was a black fraternal society which I think was founded, actually they claim they were founded as a kind of a slave rebellion conspiracy in the 1850s, but pretty much founded in the 1860s. And these organizations were really quite common in American society during this period among blacks as well as whites. You have groups like the Loyal Order of Moose, the Odd Fellows, the Masons, the Polish National Alliance. And like these groups, it had rituals, it had secret handshakes, it had very colorful sort of drill teams, that would march around in processions. But it had much more of a social role than a social role, unlike, like these other groups. It was, before the rise of the welfare state, this was one of the main methods by which people provided social welfare. And fraternal societies were especially important among blacks for that purpose. They were a means by which people would pool their resources to provide insurance, to provide employment information. They had orphanages, they had homes for the elderly, and the Knights and Daughters of Tabor was sort of typically in that tradition. And if you look at its statement of purpose, it reads very similarly to the statement of purposes of your typical fraternal societies. It pledges to advance Christianity, education, morality and temperance, and the art of governing self-reliance and true manhood and womanhood. And I think that this whole area of research of fraternal societies is a great research opportunity for those of you that are interested, because it's been sadly neglected by historians. Far more workers, for example, in the 19th century were in lodges than in labor unions. We have very little research, relatively little research on them, and they sort of defy some of our stereotypes, right? Because they all look very similar, depending on different ethnic groups. They transcend the normal divisions of class and gender to some extent. In fact, the Knights and Daughters of Tabor, 2/3 of its membership were women, which was actually fairly common phenomenon among many black fraternal societies. In any case, this is a picture of the hospital, which opened in 1942 in the all-black town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi, which is right in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, which is where most blacks lived in the state of Mississippi, still do live there. The town itself was a great place if you were going to have a black-owned hospital. The town had been founded in the 1880s by an ex-slave of the brother of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. It's kind of a philanthropic enterprise, I guess, in some sense. But it ended up as the only town really in Mississippi, of any substance anyway, where blacks could actually vote and hold office and continue to vote and hold office all through the 20th century. It was an all-black town. It had a black mayor. It had a black police chief. And it was a very ideal, nurturing environment for a hospital of this type. Because in a lot of places in Mississippi, you had curfews, you had times of day where if you were black and you were out, you'd be harassed. And in Mound Bayou, it was a relatively safe environment. Well, anyway, this hospital had been built by brick by brick through voluntary contributions, fundraising campaigns in the 1930s. This is from a very poor membership. Vast majority of the membership of the Knights and Daughters of Tabor would be considered today under the poverty line. It was really quite an amazing accomplishment, all done without much in the way of philanthropy from outside sources, or no governmental aid at all. All right, it opens in 1942, and the facilities included 2 major operating rooms, an X-ray room, sterilizer, incubators, electrocardiograph, blood bank, and laboratory. It had several doctors on staff. All were black. The whole entire medical personnel, the people that ran the institution were black. And in 1944, you paid annual dues to the Knights and Daughters of Tabor of $8.40, which would be about, again, these are sort of comparing apples and oranges, but if you do that little inflation calculator, that would be, what, $95 now. And that entitled you to, if you were a member, to 30 days of hospitalization in a year. That would include major and minor surgery. If you had a child, you could enroll them for $1.20 a year. All right? So this is quite an accomplishment in healthcare in many ways. And in later years, they are relying quite heavily on Meharry Medical College. Meharry would send its interns there, for example. Well, the hospital gets an enormous response from blacks in the Delta. Howard, again, is the chief surgeon. And partly because of his sort of dynamic personality and the services offered by the Knights and Daughters of Tabor, the membership grew rapidly. And by 1945, it had, just in Mississippi, 50,000 members, which I think easily made it the largest black voluntary association in the state of Mississippi. Again, 2/3 of the members were women, most quite poor, sharecroppers, farm tenants, that kind of thing. A lot of activities you can see. Howard delivered thousands of babies when he was there, maybe performed 12 operations a day. And this is a picture here of patients waiting to see doctors at the Taborian Hospital. That's in 1946. And blacks would come from all over the Delta. It was really the main hospital for blacks in the Mississippi. Well, there was another one too, but it was one of the, in that area anyway, in that immediate area. All right, and there's a picture of Howard examining a patient. Now for Howard, both these hospitals were springboards to a whole bunch of other business enterprises that he got involved in during the period. He established the first swimming pool for blacks in Mississippi. And we're not talking about some little pool. It was first rate. A 1,600-acre cotton and cattle plantation. He had a restaurant with a beer garden. He had a home construction firm. He had a small zoo. There's a picture of him on his plantation with his son, Ronald. It gives you a little bit of the sort of the lifestyle of the Howards, I suppose, here, the aristocratic lifestyle, one could say. There's Howard with and Mrs. Howard, Helen Howard. I haven't talked much about her, but she was had a very different background than her husband had. She was from California. That's where he met her. She came, I guess you could say, from the black elite. There was a book written very recently about her brother, Ed Boyd, who was one of the first black executives in Pepsi-Cola. And any of you done any business history, you might have come across his story. But she was very much tied in with this elite, right? And she sort of helped to smooth it over and helped to bring her husband into that black elite. Howard's an interesting guy in that if he's somewhere and there's a maid or somebody sweeping the floors, he'll strike up a conversation with them. Somebody important, quote, wants to talk to Howard, and Howard's going to take his time talking to the ordinary people. But he can also move in that world of the black elite, almost effortlessly move between them, because he had come from this modest background, but then he's got this sort of entree, and he's got a personality. Howard is definitely the kind of guy that that'll charm the socks off you. Someone said you could charm your shoes off in a snowstorm. He could, he was a promoter. He was a pitchman. He could make a pitch to you. Someone said he's sort of the P.T. Barnum of the civil rights movement, which I don't think is entirely inaccurate. But he also was the kind of guy that, he was like a Bill Clinton in a way. You'd feel like you were the center of attention when you were with him, I suppose. Anyway, there's a picture of the zoo. That's from Ebony magazine. It's called Goodwill Park. They had an aquarium there and a zoo, and he brought these, spider monkeys in there. And it was like, a big deal. This is a small town in Mississippi. And it was, made it kind of put it on the map for the first time in a long time. It had been in decline. He also purchases an insurance company, which we're going to come back to, which was a purely commercial enterprise called the Magnolia Mutual Life Insurance Company. And he is the head of that. And it sells life insurance, but it also sells hospitalization insurance. He also split off from the Knights and Daughters of Tabor at one point and set up his own fraternal society called the United Order of Friendship. So he's got like 50 different things going on here. Now, Howard is very much successful. He could have just continued on with that. He's got a lot of white friends. One guy, a Jewish automobile, runs an automobile dealership named Cosman. Howard has a very good relationship with him, but with the white business elite. He could have stayed there, and been comfortable, but he decides at a certain point to get more involved in civil rights. He had been involved in civil rights in California quite heavily. Written a regular column for the main black newspaper in Los Angeles, pushing civil rights agenda. But now he's sort of moving back into that direction. And in 1951, he forms an organization called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. And here is the board of directors of the Regional Council in 1955. And through this, he pushes a message of self-help, of mutual aid, of thrift, of equal political rights, of equal voting rights. And so in some sense, although I think this whole Washington-Du Bois debate should be thrown out the window, because I don't think it really works very well. There's a new book on Washington, by the way, but let's assume it works. What he has done is he has weaved together in some ways, the ideas of a Booker T. Washington, who was one of his heroes, and W.E.B. Du Bois, because the whole purpose of this is it's the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. These are the key leaders, the key black leaders in the state of Mississippi, right at this table, just about all of them. College presidents, heads of fraternal societies, agricultural leaders, very few clergy, incidentally. Very few. This is what makes him different. The clergy has, they're there. The clergy is relatively weak, I think, in rural Mississippi. So this is not, it's a bit of a difference here with King. But he's going to try to reach the masses through the leaders of the masses. In fact, that's what they say. To guide our people in their statement of purpose. To guide our people in their civic responsibilities regarding education, registration, and voting, law enforcement, tax paying, the preservation of property, the value of savings, and in all things which will make us stable, qualified, conscientious citizens. All right? So yeah, they're doing civil rights, they're doing voting rights, but one of the things he might do, if you show up one of these conferences, he'll give you a few bags of seed and urge you to, grow something other than cotton, right? Now, Howard's example had a very strong impact on these two people, Medgar Evers and Myrlie Evers, and Medgar's wife. Medgar Evers had come out of college, Alcorn, in 1952. He was hired out of college by Howard to sell insurance for the Magnolia Mutual Life Insurance Company. And I've spoken to Mr. Evers' successor, who's still very much alive, who inherited his insurance territory, and said that Medgar Evers was quite a good insurance salesman, interestingly enough, aspect of him that you don't often hear about. But Evers had a chance, this gave Evers an opportunity to really see a lot of different people, go to all these different plantations, because insurance ownership rates were were incredibly high among blacks. In fact, that's another thing that not many people have written about, the high levels of insurance ownership. So anyway, he's going out selling insurance for the company. His wife, Myrlie, who was recently chairperson of the NAACP and gave the benediction at the inauguration, second inauguration of Obama. She worked for the company as well. She worked as the company for a typist. Howard delivered her first two children. And she wrote about him in striking language. I thought, this is 40 years ago she wrote. No one picked up on this, or very few people did. Let's put it that way. Surprisingly. It's like, when I read this, I got to say, I got to write about this guy. I got to know more about him. And here's what she said about him. One look told you he was a leader, kind, affluent, and intelligent. That rare Negro in Mississippi who had somehow beaten the system. And then she has description of his, success at the track and his, he's the kind of guy who would change his wardrobe several times a day, always very well dressed, very stylish. I'd love to get someone interested in making a Howard movie, but it would not be your typical civil rights movie with, a spiritual in the background. It would be jazzy, right? Everybody just dressed to the max. I think it would just really, if you know any producers, I think this could really break the mold here. All right, now, Evers is not only selling life insurance for Dr. Howard, but he's also promoting membership in the Regional Council and also in the NAACP. Howard's in the NAACP as well. But he's a black maverick. So he's sort of, he has his own approach. And that is true in a lot of ways. There were these local organizations, and they had a kind of uneasy relationship with the NAACP because they were dealing more with the kind of realities on the ground that the NAACP wasn't necessarily prepared for. Okay, now again, Howard is combining together an emphasis on self-help, of economic cooperation, voting rights. He's very much into promoting black business. In fact, he is chairman of the board of directors of the, what is it called? Yeah, National Association of Negro Business, what's it called? I can't remember. Founded by Booker T. Washington, the main black chamber of commerce. And he said the following about this. The economic security of the race is tied up in the Negro support of Negro business. It is no encouragement to me that the religious songs that the Negro like best are, take all this world but give me Jesus, a tent in college, or cottage, why should I care? They are building a mansion for me over there. So he's very much into the here and now, right? Now the council, regional council, sparks controversy when it distributes, I think the term, Coward said, and I think he may have been exaggerating, but probably not much, 50,000 bumper stickers bearing this slogan, don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom. And what it did was, it urged, this is begins at 51, but it urged blacks not to buy, not to patronize service stations that did not provide restrooms. A lot of service stations in Mississippi had restrooms for whites only, right? And so their big thing was, if you don't have restrooms for blacks, you shouldn't go there. And there's stories of people, they would go and they'd ask, do you have a restroom for blacks? They say no, so they just, take that pump out of my car, right? And this is pretty risky stuff, right? Thousands of these people driving these cars, and blacks are about as likely to own automobiles, interestingly enough, in sort of rural Mississippi. So people are driving around with these bumper stickers promoting this campaign. And even more remarkable, it is a successful campaign. Because what ends up happening is a lot of these service stations end up putting in restrooms for blacks, and a lot of the major chains start putting pressure on the local service stations. Now, a lot of people might see this as, well, he's not really challenging Jim Crow, which even Medgar Evers, I think, knew in Mississippi was absolute suicide. Even as Medgar Evers was talking about going into the hills and fighting, like the Mau Mau, and, in the mountain, not in the mountains, but, going to the hills of Mississippi or wherever you'd go. And it's often forgotten that the original demands of the Montgomery bus boycott was equal treatment, right? Because although they certainly wanted integration, that would have been considered, even after Brown versus Board, this is before Brown versus Board, would have been considered incredibly risky in that context. So this is an example of a successful civil rights boycott several years before the Montgomery bus boycott, arguably in some fairly adverse conditions comparatively. Rural Mississippi, this is not, this is a very backward place in its attitudes. There are whole counties in the Mississippi Delta where there is not a, black majority counties, where there is not a single black voter, which gives you something of how difficult it is there. All right. Now, the council has this effort, and they do some other things, like they protest police brutality, make a big deal about that, state highway patrol, state troopers. But they are best known to many people for their rallies that were held in Mound Bayou. And Howard is certainly a featured speaker, but not the only one. He's a promoter. As I said, he's the sort of the P.T. Barnum of civil rights in some ways. He loves having a good time. He loves it, and that is infectious, and he's going to make sure everybody else has a good time. So they come to these rallies to hear speakers such as William Dawson. Don't know if he's up there. There he is. Dawson is, at that time, one of two black members of Congress. And the first time I think he ever spoke in the South, actually, or at least in the Deep South. And he brings him in. He brings in Representative Charles Diggs, who was the third black person elected to Congress. He brings in entertainers such as this person, Mahalia Jackson. So he's going to always make sure you got the entertainment going on there. This is the 1951 event, I think, or is it 52? I'm sorry. He brought in Thurgood Marshall as the featured speaker only, I think, a week or two before the Brown decision was handed down. But he's got all his homemade barbecue there. They've got sporting events. They've got panels on how to navigate through the Mississippi Constitution and try to go in to register to vote. And actually, black voting registration goes up quite a bit. It's still pitifully small. I think it had been in the late 40s like 3,000, and by 54 it gets up to like 20,000 or something. Still very small. But a lot of that is because of the work of the council, where sometimes blacks haven't shown up to vote at certain places in decades. Someone just shows up, and someone might be so intimidated they'll register them. So, I mean, stuff like accidents do happen once in a while. They teach them to memorize the Mississippi Constitution and all these things that these election registrars. It's a really uphill battle, to say the least, right? One of the people that's helping out at these rallies with the preparation of the food and the logistics is an unknown figure. She'll be very well known in the 1960s when she gives a very famous speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, famous for saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Fannie Lou Hamer. She gets her start going to these rallies of the regional council. This introduces her to the civil rights movement. And she's quite grateful to Dr. Howard. And her ties to Mound Bayou are quite interesting. She actually dies, not as advertising for the hospital, but she actually dies in the Taborian Hospital. At that time, it's been taken over and changed, but it's the same place. All right. There's a picture of Howard, Thurgood Marshall looking rather uncomfortable there in the parade car, along with Howard. And here's a little bit of flavor. Attorney Thurgood Marshall left and Dr. T.R.M. Howard stand in the lead parade car to watch prancing majorettes from Tennessee State, which is black university. Majorettes and Tennessee State band led parade through town of Mound Bayou to big circus tent where Regional Council of Negro Leadership was held. They had to have a circus tent because there was nowhere. They didn't tell you that. They get crowds of 10,000 people. Right? There's nowhere to hold them, so they had to put up a big circus tent, and Highway 61, which is very famous. Anything about blues music, they'd shut down like part of it and had this big parade, and the white newspapers would often totally ignore this, like, hey, look outside, you got this big parade going down, but. That's part of the reason we don't know much about him. He's covered big time in black newspapers, headline news all the time. But this is before sort of the civil rights movement kind of gets the white consciousness of it, I guess you could say, in some sense. All right, and here again gives you a little bit of the flavor of the size of these crowds. They're handing out voter information there. That is, look how everyone's dressed, by the way. These are held in the middle of the summer. I said, style, man. But that was the 1950s in general, right? And these are not wealthy people here we're talking about, right? This is a big deal. No air conditioning, whatever. All right, well, there we got Howard, later picture. Not the best quality thing. I got it from a newspaper, but there's Howard with Fannie Lou Hamer, 1965. All right, now, how are we doing on time? What we got? Okay, well, anyway, as I said, Howard's relationships. Okay, so we got how much longer would you say? 15 minutes. Okay, good. I can do it. Howard's, as I said, his relationship with whites was pretty good. up until this time, but this really starts to change in 1954. He meets with the governor of the state of Mississippi, not just Howard, but a whole delegation of blacks, about 100 of them brought in. There's Howard right there, holding forth. And they were brought in by the governor. This is after the Brown decision. And what the governor was going to try to pull off was this. He said, look, we've mistreated you, and we're going to make things better. We're going to equalize school spending. We're going to do a crash program. And I think he actually was going to try, whether he could have gotten backing. And he was going to make this offer. Separate, keep separate, but we'll do equal. And a lot of the southern states tried to pull this off, right? So they bring in all these black leaders, and they're going to try to get them to sign on. And they say, got to bring in Howard. All right. And it was a disaster for the governor. It was a disaster for this whole program, because Howard basically gets up and said, you've had the Brown decision. It's too late for this now. It's past the point of no return. He's actually quite, if you read what he says, it's actually quite a kind of moderate thing, where he's saying, well, do integration, but again, people will tend to locate in certain areas, so don't get all paranoid. But basically saying we need desegregation. You got to go along with the decision. We'll help you carry it out. And people are extremely frustrated by this. And here's a picture of the guy who organized it. You can see how frustrated he is by this. And at this point, you're starting to see news stories like Howard, public enemy #1 in Mississippi. Editorials in the newspaper highlighting how he has crossed a certain line here. And a group is formed shortly after this called the White Citizens Councils, which is sort of the anti-regional council. It's spooky how similar it is in certain ways. Very decentralized, committees that will specialize for sort of farmers, for educators, very much, and founded about 30 miles apart from each other. And I would argue, in part at least, founded in response to these activities of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. Of course, the White Citizens Councils is a racist organization that's trying to promote and defend segregation. All right? Okay. Now, Howard's efforts to defend himself run afoul of Mississippi's gun control laws. A little bit of background here. It's often forgotten that the first significant gun control laws arise in the American South as a means to, it should be regional, RCNL or whatever, as a means to disarm blacks. Of course, slaves were prohibited. Free blacks were often prohibited from owning guns. Under Jim Crow, there was an effort in many states to ban the sale of cheap but easily concealable handguns, such as the Saturday Night Special, which, according to some accounts, arose as a racial slur, that term Saturday Night Special, to describe a cheap handgun. And this was still true in Mississippi in the 1950s. The state required special permits for individuals to carry handguns on their persons or in their cars. And blacks rarely received these because it was, again, the local sheriff would decide. But Howard is very resourceful. He finds a way around it. He had a secret hiding place that he boasted about after he left Mississippi in his car where he stowed his handgun. And, I sometimes think Howard exaggerates, but then I came across an arrest report that said Dr. Howard was pulled over. He had 3 bodyguards. They described them, I don't know if they were bodyguards, but they were all armed, and they were charged with carrying a gun without a permit. Dr. Howard, however, was not armed. I thought, well, okay, maybe he was telling the truth here. Anyway, here you go. The rifle. This is from Ebony. I think it's from Ebony. A picture there. These guys are well armed. In fact, there's a whole literature. There's a book called We Will Shoot Back by a guy who's writing about this. Said these guys are are heavily armed, and that's part. And with these big rallies, you would expect more trouble, but there was never anything happening. Howard would get in these rallies, and he would do things like the late Senator Bilbo just sent a message back from hell. You know, he'd say stuff like that at these rallies, inflammatory stuff. And no one, there wouldn't be any guns or no one would be shot or anything. Like, why didn't this happen? Well, part of it is because, there are guns all over there. And whites know that they can't get close in because they'll be shot back. Blacks will shoot back. So this is a bit different than King, and that's, although maybe not as different as you might think, but that there's very much a gun culture. There is a Southern gun culture everyone talks about, but that blacks during this period and later are very much part of that Southern gun culture. All right. Well, the fallout from the murder of Emmett Till in nearby Tallahatchie County, which again is in the Mississippi Delta as well, marks really the beginning of the end, the culmination and the beginning of the end of Howard's career in Mississippi. When the story is Emmett Till was from Chicago, forget what he was, 13 or 14, I forget which, but he was from Chicago and he came to visit his great uncle, Mose Wright. And he would do that during the summer and work for Reverend Wright. And he was, again, I don't have a lot of time, but we could, just briefly, Till, again, there's endless debates about exactly what happened, but he went into a store owned by the Bryant family, and something happened. Some accounts is that he whistled at the storekeeper's wife, although nobody knows for sure what happened, right? Because he was in the store with her, alone. Something pretty innocent happened, I think, or something. Anyway, the husband was enraged by this incident, which he felt was an insult to his white wife, and kidnapped Till and killed him and dumped the body in the Tallahatchie River. Howard was in Chicago at the time, but he heard about this, and it was before the body was discovered. And he made a very famous statement where he said, there's going to be hell to pay in Mississippi, and was very much involved trying to find evidence, witnesses who testified at the trial, protecting the witnesses. When Emmett Till's mother came to Mississippi to testify, she stayed with Dr. Howard, and he escorted her to the trial in an armed caravan. His efforts were appreciated here. This is a newspaper cartoon from the Chicago Defender, Shame of Mississippi. These are two other murders, and then Emmett Till. And here's T.R.M. Howard coming to the rescue, followed shortly behind by Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP. There's another picture of Dr. Howard with Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, and Willie Reed, who just died recently. We interviewed several years ago, who was a key witness in the case. Oh, there we go. Now, what happened during the trial? Well, the defendants were actually tried, which was something that hadn't happened much before, but they were acquitted after a very short jury deliberation. Howard had predicted it was going to end up that way. He made his big effort, but he said, you've got about as much chance as convicting a white man of killing a black person in Mississippi as you do. I forgot what the comparison he made was. It was pithy, but I cannot remember. I cannot find it. I think it was something like you'd get about as much punishment if you were a white man who did that as you would for killing a deer out of season. Yeah, I think that was it. All right. In any case, after the trial, there's incredible outrage. It is a defining moment for a lot of blacks. Really helps galvanize the civil rights movement. And Howard goes on a national speaking tour, along with some other people in the case, talking about the case. And this is a picture from the Baltimore Afro-American. Again, this is typical of the kind of coverage he's getting. Speaking in October '55, the trial had been in September, but he goes on these national tour. One of the lesser known stops on the speech came on the circuit that he's doing, came on November 27, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. His host for that event, the speech he gives, this is from the local black newspapers, is an unknown minister named, at that time, nationally unknown, Martin Luther King Jr. He is the host, and one of the people in the audience is Rosa Parks, then an official in the NAACP. This was on November 27th. On December 2nd, Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus and was arrested. The story about Howard was still headline news, not covered in the white papers, but covered in the Montgomery black papers and Birmingham black papers. Now, Parks mentions in an interview that she had attended this rally with Howard, that Howard spoke at, that it was the first sort of civil rights event that they had had in quite some time. And topic of his speech, one of the key topics was Emmett Till. And she later said that she was thinking of Emmett Till. That is what she was thinking of. He is what she was thinking of when she refused to give up her seat. So anyway, speculation, but it is an interesting connection there. I think you can have a more direct causation with Fannie Lou Hamer and Evers, but that still is quite remarkable in a way as well. Now, one of the things that happens in that speech also is Howard criticizes the director of the FBI. This guy's just making enemies left and right here. J. Edgar Hoover, who'd been head of that organization for decades, and he said in that speech and others, "It's getting to be a strange thing that the FBI can never seem to work out who is responsible for the killing of Negroes in the South." Hoover is so outraged by this that he writes a letter, an open letter to Howard, which he sends to all the newspapers. And it is republished and quoted extensively. And he says Howard is making intemperate and baseless charges. And they, have this little correspondence. Here's a edit cartoon on the Howard-Hoover conflict from the Baltimore Afro-American pointing that out. Well, anyway, let's go through this. Howard leaves not long after the Till trial. And why did he leave? Well, he certainly got a lot of death threats. He's on a Klan death list. But his family is also being threatened. And his wife never had liked Mississippi. She grew up in California, and this is quite a contrast to her. And she was slapped around by a patrolman, highway patrolman, and actually talked to someone who, it's not a comfortable conversation, who knew the guy that did it. And, stuff like that. All kinds of harassment, financial pressures. In any case, he may have seen opportunity in Chicago. He moves to the south side of Chicago, where he promptly begins planning to run for Congress. And in 1958, he is the Republican candidate. He had been a Republican way back when, became a Democrat, and then he became a Republican to support Eisenhower, who actually ends up getting about 40% of the black vote in 56. Republicans made big inroads that year. And he runs for Congress in 58 against Representative Dawson, the same guy that he'd brought in to give the talk. He's destroyed in a landslide. Not a good year for Republicans, a recession, a number of other things conspire against it, and Dawson runs a well-oiled political machine, but the president does come through and campaigns with him very briefly before the election. In latter years in Chicago, Howard increasingly indulges in his favorite pastime. Not a politically correct guy, no matter what you want to say about him. He is a big game hunter. In fact, he boasts that he is the leading American black big game hunter in the world, and who am I to disagree with him? And he has a room in his house in Chicago called the Safari Room, where he has all of his stuffed animals, including a ceiling that kind of looks like, luminescent stuff up there, look like stars. Mamie Till, told me that she she was a school teacher and would take her kids there, and they loved it. And so he is, there's a picture of Dr. Howard's safari room. He went on these safaris to Africa where he was a hunter, he had grown up hunting for food. Now, he is also known for his fabulous parties, New Year's Eve parties. This is a picture of Dr. Howard at one of these. This takes up the Chicago Defender. This is the place to go if you're in the black elite or even in the white elite. And one of his best friends is Jesse Owens, the Olympic gold medalist. There is Mr. Owens crowning Dr. Howard king of the party, fellow Republican, fellow golf partner. I don't know if Howard is a golfer, though, actually. And there he is in 1972 in very poor health. However, he decides to start his own medical center on the South Side, which is entirely funded through private money, although there's a story there I can tell you if you want to ask me how he got the money. But in any case, it's the largest privately owned black medical center on the South Side of Chicago. He goes all out. The nurses dressed in Florence Nightingale garb to help promote the opening of the Friendship Medical Center. There's a picture of the staff. And here's Dr. Howard's daughter. Again, largest privately owned medical center. Along the way, Operation Push was founded in the Safari Room. Dr. Howard was a key donor to Jesse Jackson in the early years. And there's a picture of Dr. Howard, right, holding forth in his office. It did everything in a big way. He always had to do it in the biggest way possible. And there, he died in 1976. I guess I'll just sort of end by saying that, Howard is part of a tradition. He's part of a longer tradition, a tradition that goes back to Booker T. Washington, who was one of his heroes, but also a tradition that built on a foundation of mutual aid, of groups like the Knights and Daughters of Tabor, of black business success. In fact, I think we're beginning to discover more and more that that foundation really was necessary for the rise of the modern civil rights movement. And Howard is an extremely important transitional figure. I don't know if I have any time to play any audio, or if we should go to questions. Probably go. Okay, a little bit of audio. Well, why don't I give you a little bit of audio here. This is Howard from speaking in Madison Square Garden in 1956. I'll just play a little bit of it, give a little bit of a flavor. He is introduced at the beginning here. How many have heard of this guy? A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He introduces, so that's the voice at the beginning.
In Mississippi, he has dedicated his life now to the cause of answering the racialism and the chauvinism of those who would strike down the Constitution and take away the rights of the people of Mississippi merely because of color. Without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. T.R.M. Howard of Mount Beito, Mississippi. Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I come to you tonight from that Iron Curtain country of Mississippi. I tried to call back home a few minutes ago to see if we were still in the Union. I presume that we are, but I think that it is only fair for you to review just a little bit of history with me tonight. And you will recall that my state of Mississippi gave to America the late Theodore G. Bilbo. It is of interest to know that my state of Mississippi is giving to America today the present chairman of the highest committee in the United States Senate, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that chairman is James O. Eastland, one of the founding fathers of the Mississippi Citizens Council. It will be of interest to my friend Mr. Wilkins to know that I understand that the governor of Mississippi is calling a special session of the legislature to have the letters A and N and C and P removed from the alphabet used in Mississippi. And to have the words integrate and desegregate removed from the English language. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, my state would have liked to have seceded for a second time from the Union on the afternoon of May 17, 1954, if there would have been any place for Mississippi to have gone on that afternoon. If there was just one place that she could have gone, since another infamous Mississippian by Bilbo has been giving them trouble down there for 7 years, they just wouldn't move over and let Mississippi move in.
Well, Bilbo had died 7 years earlier, so he's in hell. So that's what that's about. All right, I could go on because he starts building. You'll listen to it. It's great. He just starts building in this real crescendo. It's a real stem winder at the end where he's just rocking and rolling. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of audio out there that I've seen. There is his eulogy. He gave the eulogy at Medgar's funeral and a couple other things, but wish there was a lot more. I wish we had more information about him. Okay, I guess I'll open it up now, and thank you very much. Thank you.